Grace and peace to you from our Lord Jesus Christ. Today's sermon is going to focus on the first half of the text. I'm going to read it again briefly. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Today's sermon is titled, Take Heart. Unbelievable words from the all-powerful God. And I say these words are unbelievable because if you ask most U.S. adults today, 29% identify as atheist, agnostic, or just nothing in particular. In 2014, 10 years ago, this was 5%. And so we as the church, it's worth asking ourselves, because we're the church who gives witness to who God is, when people answer these surveys, what do they imagine when they think of God? Who is it that they do not believe in, that they might believe in, or is just nothing, not worth imagination or thought to begin with? What is this God they imagine when they reject? And so while it's dangerous to generalize, and everyone, to be sure, has their own story, it does seem like there's a commonality in what they think and feel about God. And it turns out, for at least many of the intense atheists, folks who've rejected God altogether, they think and feel about God a lot like they think and feel about their fathers. Paul Vitz, he's a psychologist. He was an adult convert to the faith, PhD from Stanford. He's written a book about this called The Faith of the Fatherless. And he goes by and looks at some of the most intense atheists whose writings certainly have taken over the university, public university like I went to, and dominate our society today. But the commonality he finds in these intense atheists is what he calls, what led him to create a defective father hypothesis. And time again, he goes from Nietzsche to Voltaire to Freud to Sam Butler to the new atheists of today, and he documents that these fellows had a hard go in life. And they had three things in common. They had fathers who died early or abandoned them altogether. They had fathers who were weak, or they had fathers who abused them. And some hit the trifecta and they had all three. I'm not trying to associate ideas with life, and this could be misconstrued as an ad hominem attack. That's not my intent. But the point is they had a really hard life, and I'm sorry, and we can confidently say that God is sorry for the fatherhood and the childhood they endured. But what we want to consider, again, is what do people think about when they ask, who is God? And for many of these folks, and you can imagine if your first contact with an authority figure is oppressive, or he's abandoned you and you can't hear from him, or even abusive, it's very natural to extrapolate from personal experience and think, well, this must be how the world the way is. And so for the rest of your life, it wouldn't be hard to imagine that any contact with authority, any contact with someone who's in power, or even just more competent than you, they can never be seen as anything but a rival, a competitor, a threat, or an oppressor. And this is an idea that dominates our society today. We don't need to know these thinkers to have these thinkers' thoughts influence our society. There is a systemic study and presentation of unbelief today, and it largely proceeds from these thinkers. And so to imagine a God, the all-powerful God who created everything, that God who orders everything, who teaches us good, evil, wisdom, folly, that this God would come in the flesh and say, take heart, take courage, That God's unbelievable. It's even unimaginable. And he's just not felt in their gut when they look at their lives and they imagine what authority and power looks like. And we don't have to have had a rough childhood to relate to some of these ideas. Anyone who's worked, anyone who's been in the classroom as a student, if you've had a bad leader who's maybe been a little controlling, manipulative, impulsive, just calloused and distant, and if you have enough of that in your life, it's easy to start thinking, is this the way the world really is? Is this it? And so I'm thankful for our text in Matthew today because it shows us what true power and true authority looks like, what the power and authority behind all of creation, what form he takes and what words he speaks. Our text describes the all-powerful God in full use of his power, walking on water, right? Coming to humanity to deliver these words, take heart. Again, that could be rendered, take courage. And let's just recall the context really quickly so we can appreciate what's happening. Before this incident, Jesus was rejected as hometown. John the Baptist, who was for all purposes Jesus' greatest ally, he was just killed. And the disciples and Jesus were going to withdraw to get what we call some rest and recuperation. The crowds found out where he was and they followed him. And the disciples, even begrudgingly, as Jesus was teaching and it went later and later in the evening, they said, hey, boss, Jesus, we got to get these folks out of here. We've got nothing to eat. And of course, Jesus says, no, you will feed them. And the disciples take part in distributing the food. But this labor takes all day and goes into the night. And the disciples, no doubt, are fatigued and tired. And so at the end of a long day, Jesus dismisses them, and the disciples may think their day is over, but no, their day was just beginning again. And we've had days like this. So Jesus dismisses them, and it's night, and they're on a boat. Jesus has stayed back, and he's praying. Is he getting you got to wonder if the disciples thought, is he getting the rest that they all wanted in the first place? But the disciples are on a boat, and they're fighting a headwind all night. And you've got to wonder, and the text leads you to believe, they may have felt temporarily out of reach from Jesus, maybe even abandoned. And I think our episode confirms that. When fighting the wind throughout the night, they see a figure in the distance walking on the water, and they actually say, it's a ghost, and they cry out in fear. You see, they've seen Jesus do marvelous things, but now they don't see Jesus, and they see someone exercising a power that they could never imagine to wield for themselves, and he's coming at them, and that can only mean bad news, threat, stop, and so they cry out in fear. And this is where I want to pause, because this is our gospel lesson today. Jesus Christ comes close, and he looks like a ghost until he speaks. And when he speaks, they recognize him. Jesus, exercising full authority over creation, the one who holds creation together, is giving everyone a glimpse of it. He is walking on the water, and he comes right up to the boat, and they're terrified until they hear him speak this word of comfort. Take heart, it is I, meaning it's not a ghost, but also we're right to think of Isaiah. It is I, the God whom none can deliver from my hand. It is I, God, and I've come near, you need not be afraid. And of course, the rest of the text, we know what happens. They fall down and worship him. But this is the message that our society doesn't understand. This is what true power looks like. Jesus doesn't remain at a distance. He doesn't abuse his power and tell them to grovel at his feet. No, he comes and he shows them his full majesty and power and says, take heart, take courage. I mean, our authorities would do well to note how the God of the universe, Jesus Christ, uses his power and authority. And I think our society recognizes that this is rare. You're getting a military illustration, but Hollywood rightly depicts two kinds of military leaders. We'll call one the unknown colonel, and I want to call another the parachuting colonel. The unknown colonel is the figure in any Hollywood story, Band of Brothers, whatever you want to name it, who the men and the troops, they never get to know. He's the one who they imagine always saying, just take it. Take the burden I don't want to bear. Take the consequences of my incompetence. Take the consequences of my poor planning, just take it. They never hear from him, so all they have is their imagination, and he seems cruel. But on the other end of the spectrum is the parachuting colonel. And this is the colonel that is getting muddy with his troops who jumps in with them, and I've known a colonel like this. I've seen 50-year-old men talk about this sort of colonel in their days as teenagers. When you jump in and you hit the pavement and you slam on the ground, you look over and you see a face, and it's the colonel, the one leading the entire battalion, jumping in when he doesn't have to, risking his own life. And they'll talk about how this colonel jumped in next to them, helped set up their heavy pack, slapped their backpack and said, hey, take heart, be strong, son, go get him. He doesn't take him off the mission. He doesn't take him out of the dark, but he's right there with him. Our society is gripped by the idea that God is like this unknown colonel, cruel. He just says, take it. This text says, no. Anytime you see that hero, that colonel on the front lines, that leader on the front lines who knows you, that's more like our God. That is Jesus Christ, God coming down using his authority for you, that you might take courage. But nevertheless, the disciples in their moment, they were feeling abandoned and overstretched. Like they were sent ahead of Jesus and they didn't know what they were doing and wondering why he was back there getting some rest. But they would soon see that Jesus was going to go well far ahead of them and that they need to remember these words when he does. Jesus would overstretch himself, that of course they and you would never remain out of reach. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, what does that look like? We can talk about defective fathers or just authority figures in general. We know they might give a gift just to control and manipulate. So what does true power and true authority look like? I mean, you and I both know that we look at it every day. Right back on our back wall. My power is made perfect in weakness. The disciples would soon see that they really needed these words from Jesus as he was crossing the water. Because their leader just was going to take 4 rounds for him. One in the left hand, one in the right hand, and one in both feet, and a spear in the side. This is what the embodiment of a life that does take heart and take courage looks like. And you know that body didn't stay on the cross, but we can imagine the corpse even on our altar still and lifeless. And for a few days, the disciples were feeling like maybe they were abandoned again. Maybe they cast in their lot with the wrong guy. But they heard these words in their mind: take heart, take courage. And of course, we don't get this in Matthew's gospel, but we get it in John's. And 3 days later, the disciples are barricaded in an upper room, no longer on the boat, but thinking perhaps they've been abandoned. And the resurrected Lord, the crucified and resurrected Lord with scars in his hands, appears and says a similar message: take heart, take courage. It is I, the God who created everything, come in the flesh. I wasn't merely stretched out on a cross, but stretched out to take upon all the sins of the world, all of our defects, including the defective fathers and defective leaders. I took all those sins upon myself, and I am God who alone condemns, who alone justifies. Believe in me and you will have life. And they learned that Jesus was stretched out, that they might never be out of reach, and you might never be out of reach. And then, of course, he ascended, but he told them he's coming back. And in the meantime, when they feel abandoned and stretched out, he wanted them to hear these words: take heart, take courage. And now we know he's not only ascended, but we have this other image at the top of our back wall with Jesus on his throne, living and reigning now. And the only proper way to hear these words is Jesus Christ himself moving up and down this aisle to each one of your individual positions, whispering these words: take heart, take courage. He follows you to your living room, whether it's chaos and disorderly with young kids or quieter than you'd like. Take heart, take courage. He goes with you to the hospital. Take heart, take courage. He goes with you to the graveside for those that you've lost, and it feels like maybe they've been abandoned, or Jesus let them go ahead of him, and he says, no, I've been to the grave and I'm with them. Take heart. Take courage. If you're in the midst of parenting difficulties yourself and you feel like maybe you've been a defective leader or parent, he says, take heart. Take courage. I have not abandoned you. I've gone ahead of you. I've gone into death and the grave itself and rose again so that you may know that hope is yours and that you'll never be out of reach from me. Take heart. It is I, Jesus says. Do not be afraid. Amen.